Get out of our lives and keep that old ranch. My daughter-in-law snapped at my husband's while reading while the attorney was still holding the final page of the document in his hands. My son said nothing. He just sat there staring at the polished oak table like somehow the grain of the wood mattered more than the woman who had carried him for 9 months and raised him on that ranch for 43 years. I smiled softly, folded my black gloves into my purse, and stood up without a word. They thought they had already won. They thought the old Harper Ranch was nothing more than dying land in the middle of Wyoming. What they didn't know was that Thomas Harper had never been a foolish man. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end and let me know where you're watching from because sometimes the people closest to you can become strangers overnight. The lawyer's office smelled faintly of coffee, leather, and old paper. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows overlooking downtown Cheyenne, turning the afternoon gray and heavy. Richard Coleman cleared his throat awkwardly as if he wanted to say something but thought better of it. My husband had trusted that man for nearly 30 years. He'd helped us buy neighboring parcels of land when cattle prices were low in the late 80s. He'd watched Daniel grow from a quiet ranch boy into a businessman who spent more time checking stock prices than fixing fences. And now he sat there carefully organizing papers while my family came apart in front of him. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly over her cream-colored coat, her diamond bracelet flashing every time she moved her wrist. She had dressed beautifully for the reading. Too beautifully. Like someone attending a business merger instead of mourning her father-in-law. Honestly, Evelyn, she said, her voice smoother now but no less cruel. That ranch is falling apart anyway. You should be grateful we're letting you keep it. Letting me keep it. I looked at her for a long moment. Her blonde hair was perfectly curled. Her makeup untouched despite the rain outside. Everything about her looked polished and controlled except for her eyes. Those eyes carried impatience. The kind people get when they're waiting for someone older to disappear so they can move on with their plans. Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside her. Vanessa, he muttered quietly, but there was no strength behind it. No protection. No defense. Just embarrassment that the room had become uncomfortable. I remembered another version of my son once. A little boy wearing muddy boots too big for his feet, running across open pasture with Thomas beside him at sunset. Back then Daniel used to hold my hand every Sunday at church. Back then family meant something sacred to him. Or maybe I had only wanted to believe it did. Richard finally spoke. Mrs. Harper, perhaps we should continue this discussion another day. No, Vanessa interrupted sharply. We've discussed this long enough already. Daniel and I have investors waiting. Nobody wants that outdated property except her. Investors. There it was again. Not grief. Not family. Business. Every conversation since Thomas passed had somehow circled back to money. Land value. Development opportunities. Luxury cabins for tourists from California. They talked about the ranch like it was already dead. As though the land Thomas spent 50 years protecting was nothing more than dirt waiting to be sold. My husband had loved that ranch more carefully than most people love their own children. Every fence post on those 8,000 acres carried his fingerprints somewhere beneath the paint and dust. He used to wake before sunrise to walk the north fields with a thermos of black coffee even in January when the Wyoming wind cut through layers of denim and wool like a blade. That land had fed our family, buried our horses, raised our son. And now my daughter-in-law spoke about it the same way people discuss tearing down an old gas station. I picked up my purse slowly. If Thomas wanted me to keep the ranch, I said calmly, then that's exactly what I'll do. Vanessa laughed under her breath. Fine. Enjoy dying alone out there. Daniel still said nothing. That hurt more than her words ever could. Silence can become its own kind of betrayal. Richard suddenly looked at me differently then. Not with pity. With concern. Real concern. Like a man who knew something the others didn't. But he remained quiet. I walked toward the office door while thunder rolled faintly somewhere over the city. Just before I stepped out, I glanced back once more at my son sitting beside the woman he chose over his own blood. Neither of them noticed Richard's hand resting carefully on a second envelope, hidden beneath the rest of Thomas's papers. I drove back to the ranch with the windshield wipers moving slowly across the glass while the Wyoming rain blurred the highway into long gray streaks. The farther I got from downtown Cheyenne, the quieter the world became. No traffic. No office buildings. Just wet fields stretching beneath a low sky, and the occasional fence line disappearing into the distance. Thomas used to say the land looked most honest in bad weather. He believed sunshine made people careless. Rain forced them to pay attention. By the time I reached the Harper Ranch, evening had settled across the hills. The old wooden gate creaked as I pulled through. I had heard that sound nearly every day for 46 years. Some people hear age in old wood. I hear loyalty. The porch light still glowed softly above the front steps because I had forgotten to turn it off that morning before leaving for the lawyer's office. Thomas would have teased me for that. He used to walk through the house every night checking locks, lights, and windows before bed. "Electricity is not free, Evie," he would say while pretending to sound stern. Then he would kiss my forehead anyway. The house felt colder without him now. Not physically cold. Empty cold. I hung my coat near the door and stood still for a moment listening to the silence. No television. No boots crossing the hallway. No deep voice asking whether I wanted coffee. Only the grandfather clock in the living room ticking steadily like it did not care that someone was missing. I walked into the kitchen and noticed Thomas's favorite mug still sitting beside the sink. White ceramic with a faded blue stripe around the rim. I had not moved it since the funeral. Some things become too painful to touch because moving them feels too much like admitting the person is never coming back. Outside the kitchen window, I could see the north pasture stretching nearly half a mile toward the tree line. Wet grass shimmered under the last traces of daylight. Somewhere near the barn, one of the horses let out a soft, restless sound. Animals understand grief better than most people do. They notice absence immediately. I opened the refrigerator and stared at the untouched casserole Helen Brooks had dropped off 3 days earlier. Since Thomas died, people kept bringing food as though casseroles could somehow fill the space left behind by 48 years of marriage. I closed the refrigerator without eating. My appetite had become unreliable lately. On the dining table sat a stack of brochures Vanessa had left during her last visit. Luxury mountain resorts, private spa retreats, investment opportunities in Western land development. I picked one up slowly. The front showed smiling tourists drinking wine beside a fire pit where our horse barn currently stood. Another page displayed sleek cabins with floor-to-ceiling windows built exactly where Thomas used to graze cattle during the spring. There were handwritten notes in Vanessa's sharp, elegant handwriting along the margins. Excellent lake view. Potential wedding venue. High-income opportunity. Not once did she mention the family. Not once did she mention Thomas. To her, the ranch was never a home. It was acreage. Numbers. Profit. I sat down carefully at the table while thunder rolled faintly across the plains. The same table where Daniel used to do homework after school, while Thomas cleaned mud off his boots near the door. The same table where we celebrated birthdays, Christmas dinners, and branding season every June. Families do not fall apart all at once. They come apart quietly. One missed holiday. One uncomfortable silence. One phone call returned too late. Looking back, I could see Vanessa changing things piece by piece after marrying Daniel. Holiday dinners moved to restaurants instead of the ranch. Thanksgiving became ski trips with her friends from Denver. Daniel stopped helping Thomas repair fences on weekends because Vanessa booked spa vacations instead. Every change sounded reasonable when it happened. Small things rarely looked dangerous at first. I rubbed my hand across the polished wood surface and suddenly remembered the way Richard Coleman had looked at me before I left his office. Concerned. Careful. Like a man carrying information too heavy to speak aloud in front of the wrong people. Then I remembered the second envelope, hidden beneath Thomas's paperwork. My husband had been many things in his lifetime. Quiet, stubborn, proud. But Thomas Harper never left loose ends behind. The next morning the ranch woke before I did. I could hear the low distant sounds of cattle moving across the eastern pasture, and the wind brushing softly against the side of the house. Thomas always said ranches had their own heartbeat. Even after death. Even after loss. I stood at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee warming my hands while pale morning light stretched slowly over the fields. The mountains in the distance looked washed silver beneath the clouds. For a moment everything appeared unchanged. Then I noticed Daniel's old pickup truck was no longer parked beside the barn where it used to sit every winter. Vanessa had convinced him to trade it 2 years earlier for a luxury SUV that had probably never touched mud in its life. That memory stayed with me longer than it should have. Small changes reveal larger truths if you pay attention long enough. Around 9 o'clock I walked out toward the horse barn wearing Thomas's brown canvas jacket over my sweater. The air smelled like wet dirt and pine trees, cold enough to sting the nose a little. Duke, our oldest horse, lifted his head when he saw me approaching. Thomas bought him nearly 15 years ago from a struggling rancher outside Casper. The horse had gone gray around the muzzle now, just like both of us had. I rubbed his neck gently while he breathed warm air into the sleeve of my jacket. "It is just us now," I whispered quietly. Saying the words aloud made the silence around me feel larger somehow. I spent most of the morning checking fence lines near the south pasture. Thomas used to do it himself every Thursday no matter the weather. Some sections needed repair after the recent storms. I could already hear Vanessa's voice in my mind criticizing the old wooden fencing. Too outdated. Too expensive to maintain. She never understood that people who truly love land do not measure its value the same way investors do. Around noon I returned to the house and found a black luxury sedan parked near the front porch. Vanessa stepped out wearing oversized sunglasses and cream-colored boots completely unsuited for ranch dirt. Daniel climbed out from the passenger side holding his phone in one hand. Neither of them looked comfortable being there. Vanessa glanced around the property with open impatience. "You really should think about downsizing," she said before even saying hello. "This place is impossible for one person to manage." I said nothing at first. I simply opened the screen door and walked inside. They followed me into the kitchen where sunlight fell across the old wooden counters Thomas built himself nearly 30 years earlier. Daniel loosened his tie awkwardly. "Mom, we are worried about you being out here alone." Worried. Interesting word. People use concern to disguise control all the time. Vanessa placed a glossy folder onto the kitchen table. "We met with a development group from Jackson yesterday," she explained smoothly. "They are offering an incredible amount for the property. Enough for everyone to start fresh." Everyone. Another interesting word. I looked down at the folder without touching it. Architectural drawings covered the front page. Spa lodges. Scenic wedding venues. Private hiking trails. The Harper Ranch transformed into something unrecognizable for wealthy tourists searching for weekend authenticity. "Your father built this ranch with his bare hands," I said quietly to Daniel. "Do you remember that?" He looked away almost immediately. "Things change, Mom." "No. People change. Places remember who we really are." Vanessa sat down across from me and folded her hands neatly like a business consultant preparing a presentation. "Evelyn, nobody wants to force you into anything. We are simply trying to help you move into a more comfortable phase of life." There it was. The careful, polite version of removal. Assisted living. Retirement. Communities. Smaller spaces. Controlled environments where older people are quietly placed once they become inconvenient to younger ambitions. I had seen it happen to friends after funerals. One signature. One emotional conversation. One move that was supposed to be temporary. Then suddenly the family home belonged to someone else forever. Daniel finally spoke again. "Mom, maybe it would be easier if you stayed somewhere closer to town for a while." I stared at him for several seconds. I remembered teaching him how to ride a horse when he was 6 years old. I remembered sitting beside his hospital bed after he broke his arm at 14. I remembered every birthday cake, every fever, every sleepless night. And now my own son could not even meet my eyes while asking me to leave the only home I had left. Vanessa reached toward the folder again. "At least look at the numbers." Just then headlights appeared outside the kitchen window. Another car slowly pulled into the driveway. I recognized Richard Coleman's dark blue Lincoln immediately. Vanessa's expression tightened the moment she saw him step out holding a thick leather document case against his chest. Richard Coleman removed his hat the moment he stepped inside the kitchen. Rainwater darkened the shoulders of his coat, and the leather document case under his arm looked heavier than usual somehow. Vanessa straightened immediately when she saw him. The polished confidence she carried a few minutes earlier slipped for only a second, but I noticed it. People reveal themselves most clearly in moments they think nobody sees. Richard nodded politely toward Daniel and Vanessa before placing the case carefully on the kitchen table beside the development folder. I apologize for arriving unannounced, he said calmly. But there are additional matters regarding Thomas Harper's estate that need immediate clarification. Vanessa crossed her arms. I thought everything was already settled yesterday. Richard looked directly at her. No, Mrs. Harper. It was not. The room became very still after that. Even the old clock near the hallway seemed louder. Tick, tick, tick. Daniel pulled out a chair slowly and sat down while rubbing the back of his neck the way he always did when nervous. I remained standing near the kitchen counter with my coffee untouched beside me. Richard opened the leather case and removed a thick sealed envelope marked with Thomas's handwriting. I recognized it immediately. The strong, deliberate letters. The same handwriting that filled decades of birthday cards, ranch records, and notes left beside the coffee maker before early cattle drives. For Evelyn only. Vanessa noticed it too. What is that? She asked sharply. Richard adjusted his glasses carefully before answering. 3 months before his death, Thomas requested revisions to several legal documents connected to the ranch, the mineral rights, and the Harper family trust. Vanessa laughed softly, but there was tension behind it now. Mineral rights? Richard, this is not 1950 anymore. Nobody cares about old oil contracts. Richard did not react. He simply opened the envelope with slow, precise movements. Actually, he replied quietly, several energy companies care very much. Daniel looked up immediately. What are you talking about? Richard slid a stack of papers across the table toward him. Approximately 18 years ago, geological surveys identified substantial natural gas reserves beneath sections of the Harper property. Thomas purchased additional surrounding acreage afterward through private holding companies. Daniel blinked several times as though he had misheard him. Dad never said anything about gas reserves. No, Richard said. He did not. I felt my hands tighten slightly around the edge of the kitchen counter. Thomas never hid financial matters from me completely, but he often carried burdens quietly until he was certain of his decisions. That was his way. Protect first. Explain later. Vanessa leaned forward quickly now, all traces of polite concern disappearing from her face. How much are we talking about? Richard ignored the question entirely. Instead, he handed another document directly to me. Thomas instructed me to deliver this personally after the initial will reading. I looked down at the papers. My husband's name appeared across the top beside the words Harper Legacy Trust. Beneath that were several pages of legal language followed by one paragraph highlighted carefully in yellow. In the event that Evelyn Harper is pressured, manipulated, relocated, or removed from residence on Harper Ranch against her wishes, all inheritance distributions to secondary beneficiaries shall be permanently suspended pending reevaluation of trust conditions. Silence settled over the kitchen so heavily it almost felt physical. Vanessa's face lost color first. Then Daniel's. Richard continued speaking in the same steady tone. Thomas added this clause 6 weeks before his passing. Daniel stared at the papers. Dad thought we would try to force Mom out? Richard paused briefly before answering. Thomas believed the ranch would only survive if Evelyn remained in control of it. Vanessa stood up so abruptly her chair scraped hard against the floor. This is ridiculous. She is 71 years old. Nobody can manage 8,000 acres alone. Your father managed it with her for nearly 50 years, Richard replied calmly. And according to the trust, she now owns controlling authority over every operational and financial decision connected to the property. I watched Vanessa carefully then. Not angry. Calculating. Her eyes moved rapidly across the documents searching for weaknesses, loopholes, possibilities. Thomas had seen her clearly long before I did. That realization settled deep inside me like cold iron. Daniel finally looked toward me again, but there was uncertainty in his face now instead of confidence. Mom, he said quietly, did you know about any of this? I shook my head slowly. No, but your father always understood people better than I did. Outside the kitchen window, the Wyoming wind bent the tall grass along the pasture fence in long silver waves. For the first time since Thomas died, I no longer felt like the most fragile person in the room. Vanessa recovered faster than I expected. Some people panic when they lose control. Others become colder. She belonged to the second kind. By the following afternoon, she was already pretending the previous conversation had never happened. I watched her step carefully across the ranch yard in another expensive coat while speaking into her phone without even looking at the land around her. The Wyoming wind pushed strands of blonde hair across her sunglasses, but she barely noticed. Her attention stayed fixed on business. Numbers, deals, opportunities. Daniel walked behind her carrying coffee cups from town like a man trying to keep peace between two approaching storms. I stood near the horse barn repairing an old leather saddle strap Thomas used every spring during calving season. The smell of worn leather and hay filled the air around me. Familiar smells. Honest smells. Vanessa ended her call the moment she reached me. "Evelyn," she said brightly, with a sweetness that sounded rehearsed. "Daniel and I were thinking maybe we got off on the wrong foot yesterday." I kept working without answering immediately. Thomas taught me years ago that silence unsettles dishonest people faster than anger ever will. Vanessa shifted slightly. "We all want what is best for the family." There was that word again. Family. Used like decoration. Daniel handed me one of the coffees carefully. "Mom, we brought you a latte from town." I accepted it politely even though they both knew I drank plain black coffee every morning for 40 years. Small details disappear first when people stop truly seeing you. "Thank you," I said quietly. Vanessa glanced toward the western pasture where sunlight stretched across the rolling hills in pale gold bands. "It really is beautiful out here," she admitted. Which is exactly why investors are interested. Of course. Every compliment from her eventually returned to money. Daniel cleared his throat awkwardly. Vanessa arranged for a property consultant to stop by later this afternoon. Just informal. No commitments. I finally looked up from the saddle strap then. "You invited strangers onto my ranch?" Vanessa smiled too quickly. "Only to discuss possibilities." "My ranch. Not ours. Not the family's. Mine." The trust documents had changed something fundamental overnight. Vanessa understood it too. That was why she suddenly sounded careful instead of cruel. Around 3 o'clock, 2 black SUVs rolled slowly through the front gate trailing dust behind them. 3 people stepped out wearing polished boots so clean they had clearly never touched real ranch soil before. One man carried rolled architectural plans under his arm while a younger woman immediately began taking photographs of the property with a tablet. I watched from the porch as Vanessa greeted them enthusiastically. Daniel stood nearby with his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets looking increasingly uncomfortable. The tallest man approached me with a professional smile. "Mrs. Harper, I am Stephen Mercer with High Plains Development Group. You have an extraordinary property here." I nodded once. "It has been in my husband's family since 1948. "Exactly," he replied, "which gives it tremendous heritage branding potential." Heritage branding. Interesting phrase. People from cities always try to turn history into marketing. Stephen unrolled large glossy maps across the hood of one of the SUVs. Colored lines covered the ranch like cuts across skin. Proposed luxury cabins near the creek. Event center beside the horse barn. Scenic restaurant overlooking the North Ridge. I recognized every section of land they discussed because Thomas and I had walked those acres together for decades. The creek where Daniel learned to fish at age 8. The ridge where Thomas proposed to me beneath a thunderstorm nearly 50 years ago. The pasture where we buried our first border collie. To them it was all potential revenue. Vanessa pointed toward the barn enthusiastically. This whole area could become a wedding venue. I looked directly at her. My husband repaired that barn himself 3 months before chemotherapy started. Her smile faded slightly. Stephen quickly attempted to redirect the conversation. Naturally, we would preserve certain rustic elements. Rustic elements. Another polished phrase for destroying something slowly enough that wealthy people still feel nostalgic while looking at it. While they continued talking numbers and construction schedules, I noticed Daniel wandering farther away toward the fence line near the horses. Duke approached him cautiously. My son rested one hand against the horse's neck and stared across the fields in silence. For the first time in months, he looked less like Vanessa's husband and more like Thomas's son. Then I heard Vanessa laughing softly behind me. "Once everything is finalized," she said to Stephen, The property will finally reach its full value. I turned slowly toward her. No, I said calmly. Its value was already here long before any of you arrived. The entire group fell quiet after that. Even the wind seemed to pause across the pasture grass. Then from the corner of my eye, I noticed another vehicle pulling through the gate. Helen Brooks stepped out carrying a thick manila folder pressed tightly against her chest. Helen Brooks had known me since I was 19 years old and foolish enough to think marriage alone could prepare a woman for hardship. She stepped out of her old silver pickup truck wearing faded jeans, a denim jacket, and the same serious expression she carried whenever something important needed to be said. Unlike the investors standing near the SUVs, Helen actually looked at the ranch before speaking. The fences, the barn roof, the pasture grass bending beneath the Wyoming wind. She understood this place because she had lived beside it nearly her entire life. Vanessa's smile tightened immediately when Helen approached the group. Helen, she said carefully, we were just discussing future opportunities for the property. Helen barely glanced at her. I know exactly what you were discussing. Her voice stayed calm, but there was steel underneath it. Stephen Mercer extended his hand politely. Stephen Mercer. High Plains Development. Helen ignored the handshake completely. Instead she walked directly toward me carrying the thick manila folder against her chest. Evelyn, she said quietly, I think you should see these. I took the folder slowly. Inside were printed emails, property sketches, and financial projections. Several pages carried Vanessa's name across the top. Others included dates stretching back almost 8 months before Thomas died. My stomach tightened as I turned the pages carefully. Resort concept proposals, preliminary land evaluations, confidential investor meetings. One email stopped me completely. Once the widow relocates, acquisition should move quickly. I read the sentence twice before looking up. Vanessa folded her arms immediately. You had no right going through private correspondence. Helen looked at her without blinking. Your assistant left copies at the printer in town. Half the county has probably seen them already. Daniel stepped closer now, confusion spreading visibly across his face. Vanessa, he said slowly, what is this? Vanessa removed her sunglasses with quick, irritated movements. It is called planning ahead. Somebody had to think realistically. Daniel stared at the papers in my hands. You started negotiating before Dad even died? He was sick for almost a year, Vanessa snapped. What was I supposed to do? Pretend this place was magically going to survive forever? The investors shifted awkwardly nearby. Stephen Mercer quietly rolled up the development maps, as though suddenly realizing he was standing in the middle of something far more personal than business. I continued turning pages slowly. Another document outlined projected profits from luxury cabin rentals. Another detailed estimated demolition costs for older ranch structures. Beside the horse barn was a handwritten note in Vanessa's elegant script. Replace with spa facility. I felt something inside me go very still then. Not anger. Clarity. That barn held 40 years of our family history. Thomas taught Daniel to rope calves there. We spent freezing winter mornings feeding horses beside those wooden walls. During difficult years when cattle prices dropped and money became tight, Thomas repaired every broken beam himself because he refused to lose what generations before him had built. And all this time Vanessa had been quietly measuring where to place massage rooms and fireplaces for tourists. Daniel ran one hand through his hair and looked genuinely shaken now. You told me these were just preliminary conversations. Vanessa laughed sharply. Because somebody in this family needed to act like an adult. Then she turned toward me directly. Evelyn, this ranch is not a museum. It is land. Valuable land. You cannot honestly expect everyone to put their lives on hold because you are emotionally attached to old memories. Old memories. Interesting choice of words. As though marriage, sacrifice, and decades of work were sentimental inconveniences standing in the way of profit. Helen stepped beside me quietly. Thomas knew exactly what she was doing, she said softly enough that only I could hear. That is why he changed the trust. Across the yard, Duke lifted his head suddenly and watched the strangers near the pasture with visible unease. Animals notice tension long before people admit it exists. Richard Coleman's words from the previous day echoed in my mind again. Thomas believed the ranch would only survive if Evelyn remained in control of it. For years I had thought my husband was simply being stubborn about protecting the land. Now I understood something deeper. He was protecting me from the people standing right in front of us. Daniel finally looked at Vanessa differently then. Not like a husband defending his wife. Like a man realizing he may have ignored warning signs for far too long. "Did you ever even ask Dad what he wanted?" he asked quietly. Vanessa scoffed coldly. "Your father was dying, Daniel. Somebody had to think about the future." Silence settled across the ranch after that. The wind moved softly through the pasture grass while dark clouds gathered over the distant hills. Stephen Mercer cleared his throat awkwardly. "Perhaps this is not the best time for further discussions." He signaled the other investors toward the SUVs. Vanessa watched them begin to leave, and for the first time since I met her 12 years ago, I saw something close to panic flicker across her face. The ranch felt different after the investors left. Quieter on the surface but heavier underneath. Like the land itself had finally heard the truth people had been hiding around it for months. Helen stayed with me through the evening while dark clouds rolled slowly across the Wyoming sky. We sat at the kitchen table drinking black coffee beside the old radio Thomas used to listen to every morning before sunrise. Neither of us spoke much at first. Some friendships become strong enough to survive silence. Around 7 o'clock Helen finally placed her coffee cup down carefully. "There is more," she said softly. I looked at her over the rim of my mug. "More than what was already in the folder?" She nodded once. "Vanessa has been meeting with assisted living representatives in Cheyenne." My hand stopped moving immediately. Helen reached into her purse and slid another folded paper across the table toward me. It was a printed brochure from a retirement community nearly 40 miles away. Peaceful Meadows Senior Living. Personalized transitional care plans. Across the bottom corner someone had written my name in blue ink beside a room number estimate. I stared at the paper quietly for several seconds. Not shocked. Not anymore. Just tired. Deeply tired in the way only betrayal can exhaust a person. "Richard mentioned something similar last month," Helen continued carefully. "Thomas became suspicious after Vanessa asked questions about power of attorney paperwork while he was still in treatment." Outside the kitchen window the porch light flickered softly against the darkness settling over the ranch yard. I remembered one afternoon almost a year earlier when Vanessa insisted I should consider moving closer to town because ranch life was becoming too demanding for someone my age. At the time I thought she was trying to be thoughtful. Looking back now, I could finally see the shape of her intentions forming piece by piece long before Thomas died. Some plans begin quietly, like cracks spreading beneath ice. Daniel called around 8:30. I let the phone ring twice before answering. His voice sounded strained immediately. "Mom, I need to explain some things." I remained silent. He exhaled heavily on the other end of the line. "I did not know Vanessa was contacting retirement facilities. But you knew she wanted to sell the ranch." Another long silence followed. "I thought it made financial sense," he admitted quietly. "Financial sense." I closed my eyes briefly. "Your father used to wake up at 4:30 every morning during winter storms to keep cattle alive," I said softly. "Not because it made financial sense. Because responsibility mattered to him." Daniel sounded smaller somehow after that. Less certain. "Mom, Vanessa thought she was helping us build a future. And what future was I supposed to have?" I asked calmly. He had no answer for that. Only breathing, faint and uneven through the phone line. Finally he spoke again. "Things got complicated after Dad got sick." "No. Illness does not create character. It reveals it." After we ended the call, I walked slowly through the house turning off lights one room at a time. Thomas always liked the ranch quiet at night. "Too much noise makes people forget how to think," he used to say. In our bedroom his boots still rested beside the closet exactly where he left them before his final hospital stay. Dust had settled lightly across the leather now. I sat on the edge of the bed staring at them for a long time. 48 years of marriage leaves traces everywhere. In drawers. In photographs. In habits your body still remembers after the person is gone. Around midnight headlights appeared outside the front window unexpectedly. I looked through the curtains and saw Daniel's SUV parked near the porch. He stepped out alone this time. No Vanessa. The cold night wind pushed hard against his jacket as he walked toward the house. When I opened the front door, he looked exhausted. Older than 43. "Can I come in?" he asked quietly. I stepped aside without speaking. Daniel entered slowly and glanced around the living room like a man returning to a place he no longer fully recognized. His eyes stopped briefly on the family photographs lining the fireplace mantel. Christmas mornings. Rodeos. Summer cookouts. Thomas standing proudly beside him after Daniel's first successful cattle auction at 17. "I think Dad knew," Daniel said suddenly. "About Vanessa. About all of this." I sat down carefully in Thomas's old armchair. "Your father understood people very clearly." Daniel rubbed both hands over his face. "I thought she just wanted us to have a better life." "And now?" I asked. He looked toward the dark window where the ranch stretched unseen beyond the glass. "Now I do not know what she wants anymore." Somewhere outside, a loose section of fence tapped softly against wood in the wind. Slow. Steady. Like a warning nobody listened to. Until it was too late. 3 days later, Richard Coleman requested another meeting at his office in Cheyenne. This time his voice over the phone sounded formal in a way I had not heard before. Careful. Measured. Like a man preparing people for consequences they were not expecting. Daniel arrived separately that afternoon, looking pale and exhausted beneath the fluorescent lights of the law office lobby. Vanessa came 10 minutes later wearing a cream-colored coat and carrying herself with the same polished confidence she always used like armor. But I noticed something immediately. She looked nervous now. Truly nervous. Richard led us into the conference room where rain tapped steadily against the tall windows overlooking downtown traffic. The same oak table stood beneath the soft yellow lights. The same leather chairs. The same smell of old paper and coffee. Only the atmosphere had changed completely. Nobody spoke while Richard organized several thick folders across the table. Finally, he sat down slowly and folded his hands together. "After recent developments," he began calmly, "I was instructed to formally disclose the final provisions of the Harper Legacy Trust." Vanessa leaned forward immediately. "Final provisions?" Richard opened one of the folders carefully. Thomas Harper established multiple conditional clauses connected to inheritance distribution, operational ownership, and mineral rights revenue. Daniel rubbed his forehead tiredly. "Dad never told me any of this existed." Richard looked at him quietly. "Your father believed character reveals itself more clearly when people think nobody is watching." Silence settled heavily over the room after that. Richard continued turning pages slowly. The Harper Ranch, all connected mineral rights, future royalty payments, and operational authority are now held entirely under Evelyn Harper's sole control for the duration of her lifetime. Vanessa's jaw tightened instantly. "Temporary control," she corrected sharply. Richard looked directly at her. "No, Mrs. Harper. Exclusive control." He slid another document across the table. "Furthermore, any beneficiary found attempting coercion, manipulation, involuntary relocation, or unauthorized sale negotiations connected to Mrs. Harper shall permanently forfeit all trust distributions." Daniel stared at the paper in disbelief. Vanessa's voice became colder. "This is absurd. You cannot seriously expect a 71-year-old woman to manage millions of dollars in assets alone." Richard did not blink. Thomas Harper expected exactly that. I remained silent while the storm outside grew heavier against the windows. Part of me almost wished Thomas were sitting beside me just once more so I could ask how long he carried these fears alone before deciding to protect me this way. Daniel finally looked toward Richard again. "What happens to my inheritance?" Richard paused briefly before answering. "You will continue receiving a fixed annual trust payment established by your father." Vanessa leaned forward sharply. "How much?" Richard adjusted his glasses. $2,000 per month." The room went completely still. Vanessa stared at him as though she had misheard the number. "That is impossible." "No," Richard replied calmly. "It is legally binding." Daniel looked stunned. "Dad controlled all those gas rights and left me $2,000 a month?" Richard's expression softened slightly then. "Your father once told me something during our final meeting." He opened another folder and removed a handwritten letter. He said the ranch was never meant to make his son wealthy. It was meant to teach him responsibility. Vanessa pushed her chair back hard enough that it scraped loudly against the floor. This entire situation is insane, she snapped. Evelyn manipulated him during his illness. I looked at her quietly across the table. Your father-in-law spent 50 years building that ranch before you ever stepped onto it. She laughed bitterly. That old ranch is sitting on millions of dollars, and you are going to waste it feeding horses and fixing fences? No, I said softly. I am going to preserve it. Daniel suddenly spoke again, but this time his voice sounded different. Lower. More awake somehow. Vanessa, he said slowly, did you ever actually care about the ranch at all? She turned toward him immediately. I cared. About our future. No, he replied quietly. You cared about selling my family's history. Her face hardened completely then. Whatever softness or performance she usually carried disappeared all at once. Your family's history does not pay modern bills, Daniel. Richard carefully closed the final folder in front of him. Actually, he said calmly, the mineral rights currently generate more than enough revenue to maintain the ranch indefinitely. Vanessa looked physically shaken now. Months of planning, investor meetings, development negotiations, all collapsing inside one quiet legal office while rain fell steadily outside. I thought about the first cruel sentence she threw at me after Thomas died. Keep that old ranch. She never understood the ranch was never my punishment. It was my protection. Richard finally stood up and gathered the documents together. Your father believed wealth reveals people, he told Daniel quietly. And unfortunately, he was correct. The first snowfall came early that year. Thin white frost covered the pasture fences and settled softly across the roof of the horse barn, while dawn spread pale light over the Wyoming hills. I stood alone on the front porch wrapped in Thomas's old canvas jacket, holding a cup of black coffee between both hands as cold wind drifted through the valley below. The ranch looked peaceful again. Not perfect. Grief never leaves a place untouched. But peaceful in the way only truth can finally make something peaceful after months of tension and pretending. Vanessa moved out 2 weeks after the final trust meeting. Quietly. No dramatic goodbye. No apology. One moving truck. Several expensive suitcases. Silence. Daniel told me later she had accepted a position with a development company in Denver. Apparently she was very talented at selling visions of places she never intended to love herself. I did not hate her anymore. Hatred requires energy. And after everything that happened, I found I preferred calm instead. Daniel visited the ranch every Sunday now. At first he arrived looking ashamed of himself, carrying groceries or offering to repair broken fence posts as though labor alone could rebuild trust. But over time something slowly changed in him. One morning I found him inside the barn brushing Duke before sunrise exactly the way Thomas used to. Another afternoon he spent 4 hours repairing irrigation lines in freezing temperatures without complaining once. Grief had stripped something artificial away from him. Pain sometimes does that. It forces people to decide who they really are when nobody else is speaking for them anymore. We still did not talk much about Vanessa. Some subjects become quieter after they are finished. But one evening while we sat beside the fireplace listening to snow hit the windows, Daniel finally looked at me and said, Dad knew I was getting lost, did he not? I stared into the fire for several seconds before answering. Your father believed people can find their way back if they are willing to stand still long enough to see where they wandered from. Daniel nodded slowly after that. There were tears in his eyes, but he did not look away this time. The ranch continued moving through its seasons the way it always had. Cattle still needed feeding before sunrise. Fences still broke after storms. The horses still gathered near the barn whenever snow clouds rolled over the mountains. Life does not stop simply because your heart has been broken. In many ways that saved me. Responsibility leaves very little room for self-pity. A month later Richard Coleman drove out to the ranch carrying updated financial reports connected to the mineral rights. The numbers were larger than anything Thomas and I ever imagined when we first bought neighboring land decades ago. Enough wealth to live comfortably for the rest of my life without ever selling a single acre. Richard handed me the paperwork while standing beside the kitchen window overlooking the pasture. Thomas was very precise, he said quietly. He wanted this ranch protected long after he was gone. I smiled faintly. He always planned farther ahead than people realized. Richard hesitated briefly before speaking again. You know, most people in your position would probably sell now. I looked outside toward the north ridge where sunlight reflected softly across fresh snow. Then most people never loved this place properly. After he left, I walked slowly out toward the barn as evening settled across the property. The air smelled like pine trees, cold earth, and wood smoke drifting from the chimney. Duke lifted his head when he saw me approaching. Somewhere far beyond the hills, a coyote called into the fading light. I rested one hand against the old wooden fence Thomas repaired countless times over the years, and looked across the land that nearly tore my family apart. Funny thing about inheritance. People think it is about money, land, property. But Thomas understood something most people never do. Real inheritance is character. It is loyalty. It is knowing what deserves protection even when everyone else calls it outdated. Daniel stepped out from the barn carrying a bucket of feed over one shoulder. For a moment in the fading sunset, he looked so much like his father that it almost hurt to breathe. He walked over quietly and stood beside me without speaking. Together we watched snow drift slowly across the pasture while the last light disappeared behind the mountains. And for the first time since Thomas died, the ranch no longer felt lonely. Simply felt like home.